So what I'm going to do is just talk fairly quickly. I'm not sure how long my presentation is, so I'm going to go very quickly, and I can slow down at the end if necessary. I'm going to compare three mega projects, sort of transport infrastructure mega projects, the Shanghai BUND, then the Boston Big Dig, and I'm going to finish on CROSSRAIL, and really talk about how successful they were and how they actually were able to deliver what they did, because actually the methodology of delivery and the political sort of background was extremely different in each. The Shanghai BUND, for those who've been to Shanghai I think, 2006, the harbour was cut off by this is a massive 12 or 10 lane highway along the entire BUND, which is very long, and it's probably about 1.5 kilometres or 2 kilometres, are these incredible neoclassical buildings. And it sort of comes out of the historical reason why Shanghai happened in the first place. It was a key port, and then these were financial institutions and trading companies and all the rest. And they had this relationship to the port and to presumably their own ships. But what had happened in the sort of probably 60s and 70s was that these beautiful buildings, and you can see just that, you know, how many you've got along the bottom. And that's actually not the entire length, but those are probably the key buildings. But they were all cut off from the river. So there was this massive highway, and it was very few crossing points, and of course, traffic and pollution. So they were kind of pushed away from the river, and it was really impossible to even appreciate them as buildings. And that's kind of, you know, the sort of quality that it's so rich and stunningly beautiful. So this all the way along here was this sort of 10, 12 lane highway. There was a little bit of sort of stuff here. The sort of wharfs that were in that ancient picture obviously didn't exist anymore, and the level of the riverbanks has been raised to prevent flooding and so on. But you still couldn't really see the river, and you couldn't appreciate the buildings. So when the sort of Expo was coming in 2010, the planners sat down, and this is absolutely the truth and the fact, because I know one of the planners that was involved in it. They said, in 4 years' time, we're going to have Expo. We're going to have all these millions of people coming to Shanghai, and our greatest asset in Shanghai, we can't show it to them because it's impossible to get to. So don't you think we should do something about the traffic? And really the solution would be to bury the traffic underneath so that we can actually expose these buildings and give them a proper setting. So that is what they ended up with. What they did was they buried the entire highway underneath in a tunnel, and they left just four lanes of local traffic at the surface. So there still is activity. It hasn't been 100% pedestrianised, and I think that's the success of it. You still have the sort of local activity going, but you've got crossing points almost at every city block. And then you've got this massive sort of open space. So, I mean, just compare kind of that quality to that quality, and you can see the difference. And that's actually what you wound up having. So you've got this sort of street here, then you've got sort of park zone here, which is sort of buffer, and then this elevated because of the elevation of the flood defences. You've got this massive long boardwalk. You can see up there, I mean, it's not unusual for it to be that crowded. It's the most amazing place because you've got the river's very active. There are boats up and down all the time. There's a boat every 30 seconds. Huge boats, not little Thames boats, but real big boats. But people come out, and the last time I was there was like in December, freezing cold and windy. And I walked along the whole length. I thought, I've got to get some pictures. And actually, it was mobbed, even on a cold, windy day. So incredibly successful. Context of all that is obviously Shanghai doesn't have too much problems planning and delivering projects. They did it in 4 years. The second one is the Boston Big Dig. That was about, I think, a 25 to 35-year delivery process. Very expensive, but that was obviously the progressive dream in the 60s, elevated highways, no traffic lights, you're never interrupted, you flow through the city at high speed, and that was really what it looked like back before they started the Big Dig, and that was the aspiration, and in fact what they delivered. And you might say, wow, that is pretty fantastic, because you are getting rid of all that traffic infrastructure, and you seem to be delivering some sort of proper urban realm. And when you look at the Google map, it looks even more seductive. I mean, because you think you've got this fantastic chain of parks all the way along their sort of ribbon of green through the city. But the problem is that they never really considered how to integrate this into the city. So if you ever stand and look at this beautiful sort of chain of parks and stuff like that, all the people are here on the pavements either side. You've got highways either side that separate the park. You've got tunnels that go in with massive ramps and severance everywhere. So what you have is these beautiful parks that nobody ever uses. And it's really, I think, a huge disappointment in it. This project could have delivered so much more if they'd thought about people using it and integrating it and stitching it into the city, rather than just saying, we're going to lay out a string of parks that don't really connect to the city. And of course, what happened was that actually they moved the problem elsewhere. So this is called the South Bay Junction, and they buried the highway through the city, but just pushed it out here with no thought to the communities that actually live around here and potentially would have developed. So this would have been development zones if it had been, say, if they'd actually brought the highway up at surface level and kind of dispersed it through the city. But I mean, you'll never get development happening with that sort of atmosphere around you. The last project is CROSSRAIL, and I'm sure most of you know here what it's about. I mean, you may not know it's taken 95 years to get through to when it's delivered. It will be 95 years. It was first on the planning books in 1930. It was on the planning books in 1940. It was in Abercrombie's plan. It came forward in the 60s. Then it got dumped because of beaching. It came forward again in the 80s. It failed in Parliament because nobody could really agree that this was a good idea. So it finally succeeded in Parliament in 2008 and will be finished in 2018. And the CROSSRAIL bill had a very limited scope, so it looked specifically at the technical project within the red line. That's what the bill says that CROSSRAIL has to deliver. And it's purely track and station, but it doesn't even go 1 meter beyond the front door of the station. So it's very contained. And it completely ignored the urban regeneration effects that potentially CROSSRAIL could deliver. It completely ignored urban realm. So what it said to the developers, the promoters of the project, was, if you dig up the road, you have to put it back again as it is now. It didn't say that you had to put it back any better or any different, just slap some tarmac back and that is fine. And it completely ignored land value capture. So the lucky developers who happen to be around the stations are going to get rich as creases, but nobody else is particularly going to benefit from that uplift in value. Huge mistake all around. However, unlike Boston, where they kind of ignored those issues, there was an amazing and unusual sort of collaboration that took place where all the stakeholders said, this just isn't good enough. You know, we're going to be, this is a once-in-a-lifetime project. These streets, these corners of London are probably not going to be dug up again for 100 or 150 years. So we need to address how all the stations are integrated, and we need to think about what opportunities arise at every station and every place that's being dug up by the project, and to think about what we can do to improve the local areas. And as a result, over 30 public realm schemes have actually been commissioned, paid for. The schemes, the design schemes, have been paid for by a sort of combination of CROSSRAIL finding a bit of money, TfL finding a bit of money, mostly funded by CROSSRAIL. CROSSRAIL really were very proactive about this, and they went out and they said, fine, we're going to set up an urban integration program, and we're going to talk to all the people who are involved at any particular place, and there'll be a team, a sort of steering group, and we'll meet and we'll decide what the project should be. We'll hire consultants and we'll get projects that we all agree on, that we all like, so that TfL had to be happy, but, you know, the boroughs, Westminster, whoever it was, had to be happy, and the landowners, of course, and English Heritage, whoever was involved. And once those projects had sort of been published, everybody was saying, well, how's it going to be paid for? And I particularly, when I used to work at TfL, I was worked very closely on Tottenham Court Road, and I just could see, well, you know, we've got this fabulous scheme, but it's perhaps £6 million, and where is the money coming from? And Camden used to sort of say, oh, well, we'll get Section 106. And I said, well, you know, is it still going to be enough? And you've got tons of other demands on that Section 106. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that CROSSRAIL found 30 million, TfL found 30 million, and the other 30 million will come from sort of landowners and others who have a vested interest and are going to chip in. So 90 million extra pounds is being spent to make London a fabulous place. And it's a drop in the ocean compared to sort of 16 to 18 billion that the project costs. And this is kind of, so a lot of analysis. It was, and each place was very different. The issues were different, but there was a lot of thinking about what are the problems with the station at Tottenham Court Road. Those of you who can remember the way it used to be with the pool at the bottom and clutter everywhere and miserable. And that's the Gillespie scheme that sort of will have, you know, an all-red crossing here, but it's considering all the desire lines, so people will be able to come from shopping in Oxford Street and filter through here down to Covent Garden. All the tourists that come to London go to Covent Garden and Oxford Street if they're under a certain age. And so, but at the moment they tend to go by tube, and actually this is a very walkable distance. So Tottenham Court Road will be beautified. Outer London as well. So Ilford Station, for example, 150-year-old station. This is a classic. You know, the red line was very limited, the CROSSRAIL bill, so they didn't have to rebuild the station. And the council was very upset, you know, that they wouldn't get a new station, but they do get a fabulous public realm scheme. So the urban integration scheme or program took over and said, well, forget the station, but we'll do fabulous stuff outside. So instead of coming out onto a very, very narrow pavement, here, I mean, the opening to the station, there's one there and there's one somewhere here, and you come out, I mean, it's no more than about 4 or 5 feet. It's so narrow, and then there are hundreds of buses that come by. Unfortunately, this is the middle of the day, but in rush hour, I think there's something 16 or 18 bus routes that all come here. So they're all lining up, and it's just a miserable place. So they've widened the pavement. The TfL agreed that they could lose capacity on the highway, and as a result, you've got sort of sensible pavement widths and crossings and a nice environment. This is Bond Street East, which is Hanover Square, if you recognise it, which is, again, one of those sort of islands that you couldn't get to in the past. They were very isolated. The CROSSRAIL station is sort of in that corner there. But what they're doing is basically sort of saying, let's make this all pedestrian, permeable and easy. I think the railings are coming down, so it will be part of the city and very accessible, so you'll actually be able to get into it. And, you know, very high quality materials and lighting is all going to be paid for out of that 90 million. This is a project actually that Space Syntax worked on. So this is Bond Street West, which is completely different issues because it's in a very tight street, sort of near South Molton Street, Davis Street, those back streets behind Oxford Street. Very tight. So how do you manage people there? And Space Syntax, you know, had their input. So again, you're going to get a fabulous sort of, you know, not a public square, but you get really nice streets to walk on. At Whitechapel, the big issue, a lot of studying and thinking about what are the problems. Well, the problems are that there's massive severance caused by the railway. So what was wanted was, in fact, to be able to have a permanent pedestrian crossing across the railway. So that was not part of the original project, but is now part of the project because of the urban integration scheme. And finally, to sort of finish up, I've sort of been thinking about this, and I wrote an article in Transport Times a few months back, but I think the problem is that, you know, mega projects and infrastructure projects have a red line around them that's deliberately drawn very tight because the thinking is you reduce the money. You know, we don't want to pay for anything that we don't really need to pay for is the sort of thinking. But actually what we should be thinking about is a sort of zone of influence. So this is just a very diagrammatic thing, but you can imagine if that was a building that had a little station that was going to be coming out, and you say, well, okay, what are we going to do when we built it? We'll repair that tiny bit of pavement over there. But if you actually had a zone of influence that you had to consider, you might think, well, what better pedestrian crossings do we need all over here? What do we need over here? You know, and you think of the area as a whole. So I feel very strongly that the infrastructure project should be required to address this issue of the zone of influence. And, you know, do we really want to carry on kind of living like this with stations that you can hardly get into? Or would we like to live something like this? And this is another space syntax scheme, Elizabeth House at Waterloo Station. But that's achievable if you actually think about how do you integrate the station into the urban realm. So I think sort of final conclusions, I think the main thing is transport projects are not an isolated piece of infrastructure. They are absolutely an integral part of the city. So you have to think of them in that way. You have to think about how they can be integrated into the machine. You can't afford to miss that opportunity of once in a lifetime, once in 100 years, or perhaps digging up the street and rearranging things to suit what's happening today as opposed to what happened 100 years ago. And we all know it makes commercial sense that actually property values rise. And actually, at the end of the day, the extra bit of money is such a minuscule drop in the ocean. I should have worked out what percentage it is. But I mean, if you think of 90 million on 18 billion, it's absolutely nothing. That's it. And there is actually an article on this, a slightly fleshed out article in Cities Today, which should be coming out any minute. That's me. Is that 10 minutes?
That was 14 minutes.
Oh dear. It's crazy.